This video is sponsored by Temu. Do you like things? You know, stuff. You like buying stuff and things online? Well, I'm sure you've heard of Temu by now, but just in case you haven't, they're an online retailer that allows customers to buy items with massive discounts. Discounts that are so massive that a lot of people find them kind of hard to believe. But I went on a mini shopping spree and chose several items from their store, like this full set of every Zelda NFC card available, and this Breath of the Wild themed LED light, and this PlayStation LED light, and this standing room light, and several others. And I received each and every one of them in amazing quality. The cards feel great and all work as they should. The lights are bright and beautiful and ready to be hung on my wall, and the room light works so well and can dim or switch modes remotely, which is great because I don't like to get up more than I absolutely have to. They're constantly running site-wide sales with discounts of up to 90%, and get this, everything comes with free shipping and a 90-day return policy. And if you click the link in the description below or type in my code DKN9526 in the Temu search bar, you can claim a limited edition $100 coupon bundle. And if and when you use all of those coupons, you can claim a Nintendo Switch for a discount at $259. And now, on to the video. If I started writing a book series called let's call it The Tale of Zebulon, and I wrote one book, and then I wrote another and called it The Tale of Zebulon 2, and then I wrote another, and then another, and then another, and they're all called The Tale of Zebulon something, 3, 4, 5, The Tale of Zebulon, Essence of the Void, whatever. And within those books, I had references to the other books that came before it, or maybe hints about books that might come in the future. You look me in the eyes and tell me that you would not think those books are connected. And whose fault is that? It would be mine, the author's, right? So here we are again. I know I keep making these videos. This is the third one of these ramble rant type videos. And after I went live with those videos, it really opened the door for a lot of commenters to come at me with a lot of arguments. And I am a creator, but I'm also a person. You may have noticed. So I would like the chance to defend myself. A lot of people watching right now, and even if this isn't you watching, then I'll tell you that these people exist. A lot of fans of many franchises, but specifically for this case, fans of the Zelda franchise, get upset at people for being upset with Nintendo for the way that they've handled the lore in recent games. And that's fair. It's fair to have differing opinions. It's fair to care more about one thing or less about another. There's no problem with that. I take issue, though, with the argument that specifically Nintendo never cared about the timeline or never cared about the lore in their Zelda games, and that was entirely on us, the fans, back in the day, theorizing and whatever. We forced Nintendo to create a timeline where they never wanted to do it, but we held a gun to their heads and said, you connect these games or else we're not buying your games anymore or whatever. And that's what I'd like to debunk in this video. And a couple disclaimers. Number one, as always, I am a rambler. Apologies in advance. And number two, there will be spoilers in this video, probably, maybe not, but here's a theoretical spoiler warning for you. You're welcome. So really, this argument that's been brought up about Nintendo not caring about the Zelda timeline is not a new one. It's been there for the entire time that my channel has been a thing, really. I've seen these on every timeline video I make, or every time that I even remotely criticize the lore in the Zelda franchise. I see these comments just popping up, but recently they've been popping up all over the place, not just because of the ramble videos that I uploaded, but also because there was a recent interview, another one, that came out with the same people, Aonuma, the producer of the Legend of Zelda series, and Fujibayashi, the director of both Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom. It's a new interview with Game Informer, and it's a really cool interview. They're just asking about, what they're going to do with the future of the franchise. They actually say something really cool in the interview. They say that Aonuma says that he refrains from commenting on an Ocarina of Time remake, which could mean that it's just such a tired subject he doesn't want to talk about it, or obviously, the elephant in the room is it could mean that they are working on an Ocarina of Time remake, which would probably effectively break the gaming world for a little bit. But what I want to focus on is, let me find it real quick. They were asked pretty directly about the timeline. Here it is. When you're developing a new Zelda title, obviously your primary focus is on core gameplay, but the timeline placement discussion has become more important and prevalent among the fans of the series. How much consideration and importance does the development team put into those discussions? So clearly there have been enough of us, I guess, at this point, talking about the timeline and talking about the lore, that even places like Game Informer have taken notice. And Fujibayashi's answer is as follows. As you mentioned, we realized that fans have a great time theorizing and enjoy thinking about where things fit on the timeline. Cheers to that. That's something that the development team recognizes and it considers, but to an extent. And I say to an extent because if we get too into the weeds or too detailed in that placement, it results in kind of creating restraints for our creativity. The process of creating new ideas becomes restricted because we're so tied up and trying to make this fit into a very specific spot in the timeline. We do consider it, but not to an extent where we feel that our development process feels restricted or constrained. There you have it, folks. Right off the bat, we've got the answer from the word of God, Nintendo themselves, saying that Nintendo does not necessarily care about the timeline anymore. And that much I agree with. When Link's Awakening came out, the remake, it swapped its positioning on the official canon timeline from after the Oracle games to before, if I remember correctly. So that's actually something that I agree with. But what I take issue with is the notion that they never cared about the timeline, or that it's the fans' fault for making the timeline a thing in the first place. In the first place, if you are the kind of fan who says that Nintendo never cared about the Zelda timeline, honestly, you are kind of ousting yourself a little bit, as either a fan who hasn't been here for all that long, or a fan who has been here but hasn't really been paying attention. From the get-go, the first Legend of Zelda was much more detailed with its storytelling than a game, its sister game of Super Mario, or Donkey Kong as it originally was called, obviously. In Donkey Kong, Mario, formerly known as Jumpman, just scales a tower and saves the girl from a big monkey. In The Legend of Zelda, Link has to venture around and find secret caves and has to find upgrades to weapons and other items to use and battle all sorts of different kinds of monsters and go through dungeons in whatever order he feels like, and then retrieve the Triforce and battle against a giant pigman demon and then save the princess. It has a story in its loading screen, and if you have a Nintendo Switch with the Nintendo Switch Online subscription, fire up your NES, launch The Legend of Zelda, and just wait for the loading screen to start playing. It reveals a story to you. So right off the bat, The Legend of Zelda wanted to tackle a more fantasy setting with a story. Zelda 2 came out, and it was a sequel to The Legend of Zelda. A sequel to a game is a game that comes after a game. That's a timeline. And really, the timeline of Zelda games was all centered around Ganon back in the day. The first Legend of Zelda dealt with defeating Ganon. Legend of Zelda 2, or I'm sorry, just Zelda 2, The Adventure of Link, dealt with preventing his resurrection. A Link to the Past was the first Zelda game where they decided they were going to do kind of a prequel. Because A Link to the Past is kind of a origin story for Ganon. It explains where Ganon came from in the manual. That had never been done before that point. You even read that his real-life human name used to be Ganondorf Dragmire. So the fact that there was the same villain who had become this demonic, two-legged pig demon who you can read used to be human in the booklet for the game meant that it was really supposed to be a prequel. And people put those dots together. They connected those dots. Link's Awakening came out, which was the same kind of thing that Zelda 2 was to the original Legend of Zelda. Link's Awakening was a sequel to A Link to the Past. It was that Link from that game continuing his adventure. Then Ocarina of Time came out, and we got a prequel to A Link to the Past, because now we got to see Ganondorf Dragmire, and then we legitimately get to see Ganondorf become Ganon. And if you're following me so far, it's really not that hard to explain. The games keep coming out and they're kind of prequels. The original Legend of Zelda was always supposed to be kind of the most futuristic one. They kept coming out explaining the history of Ganon in some other way. Fans connected the dots because there were dots to be connected, placed there by Nintendo. But then, as you know, Ocarina of Time is where things got kind of funky, because at the end of Ocarina of Time, the timeline splits. And they always knew the timeline was going to split, and we have two evidences for that. One, Wind Waker. The beginning of Wind Waker directly explains Link popping into that timeline when he drew the Master Sword in Ocarina of Time and popped into the adult timeline, and then popping out of it after he defeats Ganon. That is directly explained in the intro segment of The Wind Waker. And the second thing I wanted to talk about were the several different interviews from the early 2000s/late 1990s, where Miyamoto and Aonuma both talked directly about the Zelda timeline. In 1999, Miyamoto was asked by an interviewer and this interview was included in apparently the original Ocarina of Time booklet. He was asked, before it was released, Nintendo announced that this new Nintendo 64 Zelda could unlock the mysteries of the entire Zelda story. Could you tell us about that in your own words? To which Miyamoto responded, maybe mysteries was a bit of an exaggeration, but you do learn the story of where the Triforce came from, and it is meant to be episode 1 of the Zelda saga. The basic order is Ocarina, then the original Legend of Zelda, followed by A Link to the Past, which obviously is not really how the Legend of Zelda timeline as we know it today is laid out, but back in the day, that was Miyamoto's understanding. In the same interview, he goes on to say that on the importance of story and continuity between the games, right now our highest priority is to create an interesting game, first and foremost. Sometimes that means not worrying about the joints not lining up perfectly, which is inevitable anyway. Excluding really obvious big breaks in continuity, we ignore the little inconsistencies. This interview explains both points. It explains that, one, it's true. Miyamoto and co. were not super concerned about making sure everything lined up. However, he was concerned with making things line up in the big picture way, in the big timeline way. He goes on to say, for that reason, I've often been accused of not caring about the story, but when I consider the medium of video games, above intra-series continuity, it's far more important to me that the player is left with a satisfying aftertaste once the experience is over. And only to that extent do I care about continuity, in that huge breaks with canon or previous games would make players feel betrayed. And we don't want that. As you can see, he directly talks about the fact that a lot of people do accuse him for not caring about the story and only caring about experience. To which he responded essentially, kind of, mostly, but not entirely. He does care about experience first and foremost, and he's a freaking visionary. He came up with Mario, he came up with Zelda. We need people who think about experiences first and foremost, obviously. But part of that experience to him, as you just heard, is canon, continuity. He says, once again, huge breaks with canon or previous games would make players feel betrayed, and we don't want that. What I'm trying to say is that Nintendo themselves created the timeline. That's all I'm trying to prove here. It's both, right? Of course, a lot of people were clamoring to figure out the secrets of the timeline. Back in 1997, when they were giving commercials for Ocarina of Time, that's when they said unravel the mysteries of the Zelda franchise. Excuse me. And there were only 4 games out before then, and they were all pretty easy to understand as far as fitting in between one another or whatever. And they did make the choice to name each of them Zelda games, so they knew. They knew that people were going to be trying to connect them one to another. They're the ones who created that situation, and I know I keep repeating this. I feel like I've repeated that 20 times, but I'm trying to say it to where you will hear me. Nintendo created the timeline. They wanted to. Now, they did not want to put all that much of an effort into making it consistent 100%. Me personally, this is where I kind of don't understand what's up with that a little bit, because to me, I feel like those don't have to be two separate concepts. You don't have to only focus on experience of a game or whatever without focusing on the story and the lore or whatever, or vice versa. You don't only have to focus on the story and the lore and then you just have a boring game that doesn't matter or whatever. The argument that was brought up in the recent 2023 interview with Aonuma and Fujibayashi and Game Informer, that Nintendo would be constricting their creativity, restricting it within the timeline if they focused on it too much, is, I think, a little flawed. Because if you think about it, is The Legend of Zelda not already a constriction? Their universe that they created, is that not already a constriction? The fact that they will not make Zelda playable after decades of people asking for it, is that not already a constriction that they are refusing to push through? They will not give up the balance of Link and Zelda and evil, the balance of the 3 forces. Is that not a restriction, but within that restriction, they've been able to come up with some pretty damn creative concepts. I mean, Zelda herself has been how many different things across the franchise? Sheik, Tetra, Hylia, and then obviously all the unique things that happened with her in Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom, all within the restriction of no playable Zelda, and Zelda not being an immediate part of the story the whole time, and playing through large portions of the game without her. They can focus on working within restrictions and working within preset patterns. It just has to be one that they want to focus on. And for some reason, they don't want to focus on the timeline. And if I may critique Nintendo just a little bit here, I think that's a little illogical. Or not illogical, but a little uninspired. Because, listen, if you give an artist a blank canvas to work with, or if you give a writer a new franchise to work with, whatever is written, whatever is drawn, whatever is painted, whatever colors they use or don't use, whatever, all of it is 100% creative, is it not? Because there was nothing there before. However, if you introduce restraints and restrictions, and then give someone the liberty to create something based off of that, in my opinion, that's what inspires true creativity. And to be honest with you, I also find it a little hard to believe that it is just that difficult. It's just that difficult to write a story within the constraints of the universe that you've already created. I mean, Middle-earth does it pretty well. Star Wars, well, okay, maybe not Star Wars, but Metroid, the Metroid franchise does it really well. It's not impossible. You can create one continuous story. Honestly, the Zelda franchise has the perfect setup for it. They just snap their fingers and 100 to 10,000 plus years will just evaporate in between games. You can do so many different things with that. You can leave Hyrule, go to a different land. I don't even have time to get into the thousands of fresh creative ideas that can be implemented while into the Zelda franchise while working within the constraints of the established lore and the established universe. So to me, that's a choice from Nintendo that I don't necessarily understand, but I digress. Just to recap, all of my rambling has really made two major points. One, Nintendo did create the timeline. Whether or not it was from goading from fans or whatever, Nintendo created the timeline. And two, Nintendo already restricts themselves in other ways, just not with the timeline apparently. And honestly, I don't think the timeline was all that difficult to understand. Initially, there were only supposed to be 2 timeline splits off of Ocarina of Time, with Ganon being created, and then as Miyamoto explained, with it then going on to lead into the original Legend of Zelda, and then Zelda 2, and then A Link to the Past, and then Link's Awakening. And that's pretty easy to understand, and even once Majora's Mask came out, things were still pretty easy to understand, because there was a split at the end of Ocarina of Time into the child and adult timelines. But as time went on, they didn't want to leave Ganon and Ganondorf as villains behind, and they kept making games with him as the villain, which became harder and harder to interpret into this timeline that at one point was pretty easy to understand. And for the games that were the most difficult to understand, like A Link to the Past, especially since Ganon is shown to be defeated at the end of Ocarina of Time in both timelines, once they placed A Link to the Past in the Fallen timeline, and then all of the other games that they couldn't explain their timeline placement also in the Fallen timeline, I think that's where all of the tension started to come from. Because the Fallen timeline doesn't make sense, and I've talked about this before. Adult timeline, child timeline, those are legitimate splits that you can understand because of the end of Ocarina of Time. But the Fallen timeline is another reality. It's the reality where Link dies at the end of Ocarina of Time. He's not able to defeat Ganon or Ganondorf, depending on which one he's fighting at the time. Obviously, if you have beaten Ocarina of Time, then that is not canon, but the fact that the Fallen Timeline exists means that it is canon. So that's why things started to get, I feel, a little icky. And for a lot of people who saw that and saw that it didn't really make sense, they started to be much more vocal about the fact that, oh, it's the fans' fault. It's not Nintendo's fault. Nintendo would never make a mistake like that. It's the fans' fault. The fans are the ones who created the timeline in the first place, and the fans are the ones who are now messing it up. And that is why I made this entire frickin' video, just to prove to people once and for all, to point back to this video whenever these comments inevitably come up in the future, that yes, fans were excited about the timeline and connecting the dots in between games because there were dots to be connected and because there was a timeline as proven in the 90s from Miyamoto, but fans are not the ones who messed it up. I think the fatal error was making the decision to include a timeline in The Legend of Zelda, but not actually focus on it. And going forward for game franchises, I think that if you're going to create lore, I think that you need to make a decision off the bat if you're going to pay attention to that lore. Because if you're not going to, why even make a sequel in the same game series? Just make a new franchise. It's been nearly 40 years. I don't think they're ever going to drop the name The Legend of Zelda. But I think that they should drop the timeline, personally. I think they should drop the continuum. I think that they should put their money where their mouths are, because in the Game Informer interview, in this interview, they were asked, does the Hyrule we saw in the flashback scenes in Tears of the Kingdom predate Skyward Sword, or does it come after the other games in the timeline? And this is one of the most infamous answers that they gave in this entire interview. Fujibayashi says, obviously there's something a bit clearer in our minds, but of course it could be that we're wrong as well. I kind of want to pose the idea that, like in real life history, you define by the artifacts and by the data that you currently have. And I wasn't aware that, real life history is just so malleable, but apparently it is. So within what we have, there might be a correct answer, but it could be a different answer. So I guess my answer would be that it could be both. Both could be correct. And Aonuma chimed in and said, I mean, The Legend of Zelda is a series of games that focuses on puzzle solving. So this is just another sort of puzzle that the users will have to see if they can solve and think about. For people who are diehard fans of the lore, that might be a frustrating answer, because basically they threw their hands in the air and went, I don't know, doesn't really matter. It's up to people to think about. But honestly, I'm not mad about that, because that's what I'm saying should happen. Drop the timeline. Let the fans who care about the timeline come up with the timeline and work with it, and just have a fanon timeline. Because at this point, the dozens of timeline theories out there work a lot better than what is canon, especially since it switches around, and especially since the very creators of the series and developers of the series themselves say, really, it's up to the fans to interpret how they want. So I think they should put their money where their mouth is and do that. Drop the canon timeline, stop these arguments between or among fans about whether or not Nintendo cared about it in the first place or whatever, and just let us write it ourselves. So anyway, that's it. I just wanted to make the final of these Ramble trilogy videos about responding to what began with Tears of the Kingdom criticism and what is now ending with timeline criticism. Again, I would like to reiterate, I love The Legend of Zelda as a franchise. It is my favorite gaming franchise to date. I love Breath of the Wild. I really liked Tears of the Kingdom. Nothing wrong with loving either of those games or not loving the franchise as a whole. There's nothing wrong with whatever opinion you have right now. And there's nothing wrong with my opinion. But I just wanted to set the record straight. So I made this video. But of course, as I'm ending, I want to just ask you people, what do you think should happen with the Zelda timeline? Do you think that it needs to be redone by Nintendo? Just reoriented with official placements for Breath of the Wild and Tears of the Kingdom finally, and maybe even other non-canon games like the Hyrule Warriors games placed on the timeline finally? Or do you think that do you agree with me and think that they should release the canon timeline back to the fans? Put their money where their mouth is, like they say in interviews, and let us figure it out. Let me know in the comments below. I'm probably not going to do another one of these ramble type videos for a while, unless there's a topic that I feel passionate enough about. But if you're still watching, thank you so much for watching. Just like I've done with the other two videos, here's my little test for you. If you're still watching, say my favorite Zelda game is, and then with your favorite Zelda game, in a comment below. You can also comment whatever else you want under that, but make that the first line if you're still watching. And I'll see, because I've been seeing. I'll know. Anyway, that's all for this video. Thank you guys so much for being here. Leave a like on it if you enjoyed it, or if you just enjoyed seeing my face, or if you like The Legend of Zelda. Leave a like for either of those. And subscribe if you haven't already for lots of gaming lore to come. That's all I've got for this one, so follow me on my socials. And that's about it. This is Bandit, looking forward to seeing you next time, and signing out. Peace!